Today I'm gonna make a 100% hydration pizza dough. Because I don't know about you, but personally I've always wondered exactly what effect hydration has on a pizza dough and whether or not a higher hydration is necessarily always better. And to find out, I designed a little experiment. Basically, I'm gonna make 3 doughs. One at 60% hydration, one at 80% hydration, and one at 100% hydration. So to keep things simple, I'm using a very basic recipe, just flour, water, salt, and yeast. I'm going with King Arthur bread flour just because it's a good mid to high protein flour that should be able to hold up to higher hydration. And it's also readily available at most grocery stores, at least here in the US. But to that, I'll add my salt at a baker's percentage of 2.5%, which means 2.5 grams per 100 grams of flour, and then start measuring out my water. And generally when I make dough, I like to use cold water in order to keep the dough temperature down, which will help to control the fermentation. And this is especially important when you're using a stand mixer like I'll be doing here, because that vigorous mixing creates a lot of friction that'll heat up the dough. Now I'm gonna start by making my 60% hydration dough. So to my water, I'll just add my last ingredient, instant yeast, at a baker's percentage of 1%. Then I'll go ahead and add all those ingredients to the stand mixer. And the reason I am using a stand mixer here is just because with higher hydration doughs especially, it's pretty hard to develop a nice strong dough mixing by hand. So this is gonna hopefully help me to get better results. And by the way, I highly recommend you pick up one of these spiral hooks if you don't already have one. I got this one on Amazon, so I'll link it below, but it mixes so much more efficiently than the sort of U-shaped hook that the mixer came with. Now the process I use to mix all these doughs is gonna be the same. I'll start by mixing on a low speed for the first 2 minutes, just until all the flour is fully hydrated. Then I'll crank up the speed and basically just keep mixing until the gluten is fully developed. Only other thing I'm really keeping an eye on here is the dough temperature, because if it gets too high, the dough might start fermenting too quickly, and it just sort of becomes weak, sticky, and hard to work with. So after about 6 more minutes of mixing, this dough looks ready. And it only got up to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm pretty happy with that. I would say 85 degrees is sort of my threshold, where if it got that high, I'd probably want to stop mixing. So anyways, I'll just transfer this into its own container as I start making my 80% hydration dough. So again, I'll mix for 2 minutes, then crank up the speed, and pretty quickly I could tell that it was going to take longer to reach full gluten development. After that same 6 minutes that I mixed the previous dough for, this one was still significantly underdeveloped. But the dough temperature was only at about 73 degrees since it had more of that cold water in it. So I was able to keep mixing comfortably, and after about 4 more minutes on high speed, this dough was smooth, strong, and ready to go. And checking the final dough temperature after putting it into its container, it was at about 82 degrees, so I really couldn't have mixed this dough too much longer without overheating it. So I'm gonna throw this container into my fridge as I make my final dough, the long-awaited 100% hydration. So I followed the same process, mixing for 2 minutes, then cranking up the speed all the way to the max. And immediately, I could tell this was gonna take a while. The dough pretty much just looked like pancake batter at the beginning, but I could start to see some strands of gluten forming on the side of the bowl, so I knew it was gonna come together eventually. So after the first 10 minutes, this one was still pretty soupy. So I decided to try something different at this point and give the dough about an hour to rest in the fridge. And when I brought it back out, I could tell the gluten was significantly more developed and the dough temperature was a bit cooler, so that was a nice bonus effect. So I got back to mixing, and finally after about 10 more minutes, the dough started to separate from the sides of the bowl to form a single mass. And after about 5 more minutes, it was actually starting to resemble a pizza dough. Alright, so it's pretty much passing the window pane test, but as you can also see, it's still pretty goopy as well, so I'm wondering if I can get it to come together a little bit more. The main problem I'm having though is because it's been mixing so long, probably like 25 minutes now, the dough temperature is getting pretty high. It's at like 85 right now, and so what I think I'm gonna do is throw it back into the fridge for maybe like another hour or two, try to bring that down a little bit, and then give it one more mix and see if I can get it to come together just a little bit more. I think if I were to do this again, I probably should have just used a little bit more ice from the beginning, because number one, it would kind of more slowly incorporate into the dough, so it should help the dough to come together faster, but it would also just bring the dough temperature down, so I could have mixed for longer overall. But hopefully this works for now. In the meantime though, I've got my other 2 doughs so far. I put each of these back in the fridge after I mixed them just to kind of bring them to room temperature. So I'm waiting for them to rise about 25 to maybe 50%. Looks like they both still need a little bit more time, so I'll be back shortly to come ball these up. So after about an hour, my 60% and 80% hydration doughs had risen by about 50%. So I went ahead and divided them up. And I'll be making 14-inch pizzas here, so I weighed each dough ball out to 380 grams. Now the 60% hydration dough is dry enough that I could use my usual in-the-hand balling technique, so after creating the dough balls, I threw them into my lightly oiled dough tins. The 80% dough on the other hand was a bit stickier, so I balled these ones on the table, dragging them along the surface to create tension, before again throwing them into my dough tins, and then throwing those all into the fridge for an overnight fermentation. Now at this point, I removed my 100% hydration dough from the fridge, and unfortunately my audio video didn't work on this clip, but I was just saying that the dough seems significantly stronger after cooling down and resting. So rather than throwing it back into the mixer and potentially messing with its structure, I decided to perform some stretch and folds to be a little more gentle with it. And after a few laps around the dough, it actually came together into a pretty nice ball shape, so I transferred it into my clear container for another resting period. It's been about another hour here. Taking a look, the dough's definitely blown up a little bit more. Definitely needs another set of stretch and folds to sort of bring it back together. And actually, as I've been thinking about this a little bit more, what I might do is rather than balling this dough up tonight, I'm going to throw it in the fridge for an overnight bulk fermentation and then ball it up tomorrow, the day that I plan to bake all these pizzas. That's something I like to do to build more strength into higher hydration doughs specifically, and it's something I get into in a lot more detail in my pizza dough mastery workshop, so I'll leave that linked below if you want to check it out. Enough about that though, let's throw this in the fridge and I'll see you tomorrow to make some pizza. But in the meantime, I'm gonna make some Italian sausage to use as a topping for this pizza. And for that, I'm using my favorite carbon steel pan from this video sponsor, Made In. Made In designs professional quality products for the home cook. Personally, I use either their stainless steel, enameled cast iron, or carbon steel every single time I cook. But carbon steel is probably my favorite, mostly because of how versatile it is. It's the ideal material for super high heat cooking like searing meats or making stir fries, because it's got great heat retention, but it's not so heavy and hard to maneuver like cast iron. Plus, the long curved handles on Made In's pans actually make them super comfortable to use. And it can also stand up to some abuse. So whether you're using one of Made In's carbon steel skillets or their carbon steel griddle like what I used in my Philly cheesesteak series, you can chop up ingredients and toss them around without any issue. It's also heat safe up to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes it great on the grill, and the sheer size of this griddle also makes it great for space consuming tasks like meal prep or even making pancakes. But possibly the best part about carbon steel is that it develops a natural non-stick coating over time. So all you need to do is wipe it off when you're done, then re-season it and you're ready to go. So check out the carbon steel griddle and Made In's other cookware by clicking the link in my description below to save on your order. Thanks again to Made In for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Now let's check on this pizza dough. Alright, so let's see what we're working with here. Dough is looking pretty nice and bubbly at this point. It's been about 24 hours since I mixed all of these doughs. So let's go ahead and ball this. What I usually like to do with really high hydration doughs like this is kind of sprinkle my counter with a little bit of flour, just so that the top side of the dough kind of gets dusted and it'll be a little bit easier to handle. See, I've kind of gathered it up a little bit and it's actually starting to resemble somewhat of a dough ball. So at this point, I think we can go ahead and divide it up into our individual pizzas. So just like with the other doughs, we're gonna go for 380 gram dough balls. Again, I'm just trying to keep the flour on one side as best I can. I don't want to really affect the hydration of the dough, but I just want to give this one side a little bit more of a handleable surface, we'll say. And there's absolutely no way I'm gonna be able to ball this up in my hands. So we're just gonna do a little on the table shaping. And with that little bit of bench flour on the top side, actually not too hard to handle here. What I am curious about is how well this dough ball is gonna maintain its shape. I'm thinking it's probably gonna flatten out relatively quickly. And so I may need to come back and reshape it within the next 30 to 60 minutes. So rather than putting them into the containers quite yet, I'm just gonna go ahead and leave them on the counter here uncovered. I don't think we need to worry about these drying out. And in the meantime, I'll bring out my other doughs to let them kind of warm up to room temperature so we can get ready to bake. Just visually, looks very different than our 100% hydration. You can see the 60% really maintained its shape. 80% flattened out a little bit, but doesn't look too bad. And again, that's the reason I didn't ball these 100% hydration doughs yesterday, because I knew they would just flatten all the way out into the container. So just looking at these, they probably could use about another 2 hours at room temperature until they're ready to bake. And I would say about the same for these 100% hydration doughs. So like I said, I'm just gonna keep an eye on these for now. And once these are all about an hour out from being ready, I'll go ahead and preheat my oven and we'll get ready to bake. So over the next hour or so, I reballed the dough a couple times to create some more tension before placing it into an oiled container to finish rising, during which time I could start baking my other pizzas. Alright, so I think my doughs are ready to go, so let's make some pizza. You can see the 60% dough maintained its structure pretty well. Still seems to be a pretty tight dough ball. The 80% though looks really nice. It looks a little bit bigger. It's hard to tell because it's flattened out a little bit more, but it still has some good good structure to it. You can kind of see like it's got that round shape to it still. So I'm gonna start though with the lower hydration and then move on up from there. And if I haven't said already, I'm shaping these all into 14-inch pizzas. And this one, just as expected, it's a little bit tighter than what I'm typically used to. There are a few things we could have done to fix that. Could have balled it up a little bit earlier in the process. Maybe mixed it a little bit less. But again, those are all things I get into in a lot more detail in my workshop. So if you're interested, feel free to check that out. It does have some nice airiness to it though. It's a lot lower hydration than I'm used to, but I still think it's gonna turn out pretty well. Cheese and sauce pre-portioned. Go ahead and toss it in. All right, and here is our first pizza. Looks pretty solid. I had it in for about 5 minutes total. 3 minutes at the oven's highest temperature, 550 Fahrenheit, and then the last 2 minutes with the broiler. You can tell it's very crisp already, as you would expect with a low hydration dough. Bottom got pretty well done. I mean, that's kind of the way I like it. I don't think that'll taste burnt, but we'll have to see. So let's go ahead and cut into it and give it a try. So this actually is really good. It reminds me a lot more of just like your standard New York slice compared to what I usually make, which is a little bit lighter and airier. But it's not necessarily a bad thing if that's what you're going for. The cheese stayed nicely gooey and didn't like over melt and separate. I guess because we didn't have to bake the pizza for so long to get it all the way cooked through. I will say the bottom got a little charred for my liking, but that's an easy fix just by baking on a higher oven rack next time. Again, I just haven't really made a low hydration dough like this in a while. So I tried the middle rack, but I should probably go for the second highest rack instead. Still a super good pizza though. I mean, there's really not much I could complain about here. But at the same time, sometimes you don't know something better might exist out there until you give it a try. And here we are, pizza number 2, 80% hydration. Already to me, this is a much better looking pizza. Surprisingly, it still has that same crispness, but it doesn't seem quite as sort of hard like the other one did. It's also noticeably more airy. I mean, the pizza as a whole just looks a little bit bigger, I would say. Again, for reference, got pizza number 1, 60% hydration, pizza number 2, 80%. And the thing I was most surprised about here was that I was actually able to bake this for the exact same amount of time as I did the other one. The bottom still got some decent charring to it, but actually a lot more toned down compared to the other one, which I'm happy about. Again, it's got just enough crispness to kind of hold up its structure. I don't know how well a larger slice would hold up. It might be a little too floppy for that, but as it is right now, it's got pretty much the perfect structure. That's a really good pizza. The cheese is like perfectly melted, stayed nice and gooey and stringy, and the dough itself has a much nicer texture. It maintained that sort of crispness on the bottom, but kind of the interior has a little bit more softness to it, and so it's a lot better to bite into in my opinion. The dough itself too has a much nicer flavor. I mean, it's the exact same recipe, but just that extra air kind of adds to the aromas and the flavors of it. It's a lot more like a rustic artisan loaf as opposed to like a cheap pizza. You know, I don't know. This one though, like I could almost eat this crust on its own, just like as a loaf of bread. With this said though, let's see if we can improve upon this even further. I think my oven's about ready to go for the next pizza, and checking on our 100% hydration dough. It's blown up pretty nicely. I don't want to let it go too far because I feel like it's going to become a little bit too delicate and kind of deflate. So I think this is just about perfect. Let's see if I can handle it though. Plenty of bench flour. This thing is so soft. It's like I don't know, it's like slime. It just like... The one thing I'm very interested about here is, obviously since it has the most water, but the dough weight is the same as the others, it has the least flour and other ingredients in it. So in theory, it should turn out really kind of light, airy, and probably unlike any other pizza I've had before. All right, see how this thing bakes up. All right, and last but not least, we got pizza number 3, 100% hydration. And right off the bat, I'm actually pretty surprised to see that it doesn't look that much different from the 80% hydration. At least at first glance. I'm assuming that the real differences are gonna come in once we give it a try. It does seem like it's got a little crisper, sort of eggshell-like crust, I would say. I would expect that to soften over time as it cools. The bottom as well, definitely not quite as brown, which is what you would expect. And I did bake this one for about 5.5 minutes this time. So 3 minutes at 550, and then about 2.5 minutes with the broiler on. Very, very interesting. I do really like this crust. As you would expect, it's a little bit softer than the 80% hydration, but it's still got those crisp areas on the exterior where those larger bubbles are, and even on the bottom's got a good amount of crispness as well. My main problem though is actually with the more internal crumb structure, because you can kind of see that, yeah, there are some parts that have some nice airiness to them, but there are also a lot of parts that are pretty flat. And I think that's kind of the same issue I was seeing with my Detroit style pizza when I tried pushing the hydration a little bit higher. I found that those higher hydration doughs can't really hold up to the weight of the toppings. And so there is kind of a sweet spot where increasing the hydration beyond that point doesn't necessarily result in a better pizza. I think we might be able to make this work, or at least something higher than 80%, whether it be 90, 95. I think we can make it work. We'd probably need to use less toppings, change the mixing process a little bit, change when we ball the dough, maybe how we ball the dough, and I think we could come up with a pretty good result. So let me give that a try. All right, now this is a really good looking pizza. At least if you ask me. This is pretty much exactly what I strive for in a pizza. The question will be whether it's crispy enough, and also whether it's really worth going higher in hydration over that 80% that I tried before. First things I noticed, got a super nice poofy crust. You can see that airiness all throughout the interior crumb as well. The bottom perhaps is not quite as brown as I would like. One part of that is probably due to the high hydration, but I did a couple other things differently here too. So this one is a 90% hydration dough, and what I did was when I was measuring out my water, I took half really ice cold water and mixed that with half ice. So basically in my water, I still had a ton of ice remaining. And so when I went to mix that in my stand mixer, the ice kind of slowly melted and incorporated. And so the gluten had a little more time to develop and the dough temperature stayed down throughout that whole process. So after my first about 12 minutes of mixing, the dough was still only at like 40 degrees. And after another 10 full minutes of mixing, the dough finally started to form a nice ball. And then after 5 more minutes of kneading, it was super stretchy and elastic, and I felt like it was fully developed, so I went ahead and put it into its container at that point. From there, I did an overnight bulk fermentation and then balled it up this morning just about 3 hours before baking. So I'm very curious to see what we're working with here. So again, as expected, this is a really good slice of pizza. To me, it's definitely better than the 60% dough. It's a little bit less crispy, but still has enough crispness to it and a lot more tenderness, which I really like. Again, it just has that more lightness and airiness, which not only gives it a better texture, but also a better flavor. The real question though is this better than the 80% hydration? Because it was significantly harder to handle. Not quite as hard as the 100%, but still a little bit of a hassle. I mean, the ice cubes in the water definitely helped, being that I was able to mix it to full gluten development without having to worry about it overheating. And because of that, you could tell the structure of this is a lot better than my previous 100%, on top of course, the fact that it is 90% hydration rather than 100. With that said though, I don't think there's really enough difference between this and the 80% to justify increasing the hydration. I think 80 is that perfect sweet spot where it's not too hard to handle. You end up with that nice bit of crispiness in the oven, but you also get that really nice airiness. So anyways, if you want to see me make an entire pizza for under $1, you can check out that video right here. And in that video, I also gave a little more insight into this similar recipe that I'm using here. It's slightly different. Obviously the ingredients are different, the hydration level, but I explained the process in a little more detail over there. So anyways, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.